if you are wondering, as you should be, what these very interesting little bits of fluff are, he has one and I have one. They are apparently magical mics. They invent things that we're about to say or haven't yet thought of saying and translate that into magical reality. No, I'm just kidding, but yeah, so these are mics. We're hoping very hard that Ranjit doesn't succumb to a violent allergy to his, because apparently as he's just informed us, he has an allergy to dander. And having started on that unnecessarily light-hearted note, let me welcome all of you to this, what I hope is going to be a really, really interesting discussion around this new book, which is actually a publication by Seagull Books, and the book we're here to talk about today, which is a series of essays by Ranjit Hoskote called To Break and to Branch, which are on the work of Gieve Patel.
Gieve.
Oh, is it Gieve? Okay, thank you. I was going to ask you, but I've always said Gieve, so which sounds better? I still think Gieve sounds better, but we'll go with Gieve. Okay, so so Gieve Patel. So welcome, Ranjit. Thank you for this opportunity for the conversation. And I wanted to just ask you to share with our audience the way in which you start your book is to position yourself in relationship to Gieve Patel in terms of being a confrere, albeit a much younger one, because there are so many levels on which your lives connected professionally and personally. So would you like to just briefly set us off on the journey with that?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Anjum. And I also want to thank, I think maybe one of these mics should be on.
One of them? Yeah, maybe we can share one. Yeah, I think I'm angled to the speaker, okay, which is right.
But if they're both on, I think they might. Yeah. So let me begin by thanking Imamiyat and the Kolkata Center for Creativity, Ushmita and all of your marvelous colleagues here, and Seagull, Naveen, Bishan, and Divin, and the marvelous designer of this book who's on her way to Paths West as we speak. But let me also revisit with you, Anjum, the reasons why this book came about in a way. Gieve was a very dear friend, and after he passed away late last year, it suddenly came back to me, in what he had meant to me, came back to me in a huge flood of memories. I think this is true of all long-standing and deep friendships, that they're part of how you're shaped, how you're formed. It's not that you take them for granted, but you just assume that it's part of your normality. And when the person's no longer there, there's a sudden sense of what they meant to you. And that's what happened with me. I realized that I was looking back at a friendship that was nearly 40 years. It was about 37 years. I got to know Gieve when I was in my late teens. We met at the office in Theosophy Hall in Bombay, in South Bombay, of Nissim Ezekiel, the poet and art critic and playwright, who was a guru to both of us, to Gieve in his generation in the mid-60s, to me in the late 1980s. And we formed a connection instantly. There was just a great sense of affinity. And then over the years, this played out across the literary arts and the visual arts, theatre as well. And it's all of that I wanted to somehow pay homage to. So the book is actually an act of remembrance in that sense. I had these essays that I'd written over a 20-year period. They all appeared in catalogues of Gieve's exhibitions. And I just felt I should put them together. Came to Seagull with the idea, and they were incredibly responsive. And then I wrote that introductory essay, which was both the framing essay and a way of thinking about what it means. What does it mean also to be a very particular kind of art critic? Normally one thinks of criticism as a neutral, objective, somehow Olympian act. But to me, it's always been productive when it comes from a place of intuitive affinity, when you are, if anything, you're a partisan of the artist you're writing about. Over the years, I realized that if you have negative things to say about people and you don't like their art, why are you wasting your energy writing about what you don't like? Unless you're making some
bigger point.
Yeah. But largely, I found that I've been happiest when I've been writing about artists whose work I love, that has surprises, that opens gateways, that that propels my imagination as a viewer. So it's in that spirit that this book came about.
And certainly those that sense of it, I think we are having a problem with the second mic.
Okay.
I was hoping to avoid it, but if I just speak, can you all
use one? We'll just share one.
Yeah. So that's what he mentions about the fact that the act of viewing, the act of looking, and the act of critiquing, in his case, particularly with Gieve's work, does come from a place of deep understanding or sympathy, connection, because of participating in a lot of similar values, similar approaches, maybe even we could say a similar kind of background of references, so that there is a great sense of discovery even as we read the book, because it's not, the work is not been at least very, very widely viewed, I think, which is also such a wonderful blessing to have these beautiful full-page color reproductions of the work, which and we're going to see some of them today as we speak, so that you have a visual reference as we discuss some of the aspects that he does. So would you like to, you had a poem that you wanted to read, would you like to do that?
Maybe I could come to
back
it later. Yeah, because we're well known.
Right.
So I'll probably do
Yeah. So let's get into it. This is
to the right, I think. Yeah.
right is moving forward.
You just pointed that.
It wasn't on. Okay. Starting with this image, which is not fully there in the slide.
Oh, it is about that much. That's the picture.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's about that much. There is something that Ranjit writes about in the book, about the kind of aesthetics of ugliness is a word you use. Later on, you also use the word abnormality, and a certain kind of brutality that that Gieve looks at very, very deeply in his paintings and renders. And there is a passage which I found very interesting that I sort of thought I could share it with you. Patel has always accentuated the hideous in his paintings. His figures are not just ungainly, they actively challenge our canon of taste with their protruding teeth, hunched shoulders, uneven features, rickety frames, tubercular fingers. Patel has deliberately adopted the anti-heroic figuration of teratology. Should we go forward?
Yeah, we could do that.
Yeah, because some of these images will reflect, not this one, but the one before, the birds.
This one?
Yeah,
okay.
The birds. So Patel has deliberately adopted the anti-heroic figuration of teratology, the science of monsters, because it's also the science of studying abnormality in the human body, right? Because its vocabulary of ugliness contests our aesthetic assumptions. We are unnerved by atrophy and amputation, which are lack, by hypertrophy and excrescence, which are excess. By deviating from our ideal norms, Patel's protagonists call our conventional apparatus of organic form and symmetry, pleasure and supple grace into question. So what Ranjit, I think you're trying to say here is that there is an expectation that art will look at things that are graceful and beautiful, or render them graceful and beautiful. But you find him going in a different direction. Would you like to just talk?
Definitely, yeah. I should maybe preface my response by saying that I'm not sure the cover image is part of this PPT, but you'll see it from the book. It's called It's called Off Lamington Road. And when Shanandini, who designed the book, chose this for the cover, I said, this is absolutely perfect. Because this is the view, of course it's imagined and extended, but it's the view that Gieve saw every evening from his clinic, because he was a doctor. And he chose to be a general practitioner. Early in his career, he also chose to spend about 3 years in rural Gujarat, working at a primary health center. So I say this because that's in one sense where his deep sense of understanding of human weakness and, if you will, the vulnerability of the human person and the human self came from.
Also the body with all its various forms of disease
Absolutely.
and ugliness.
Absolutely, yeah. So a lot of what I describe in that passage comes very much from his actual medical experience, from his practice. But with that also went a deep sense of everything that is asymmetric and distorted in the way societies and political systems are arranged. So my sense, whenever I stood in the presence of his work, as for instance this one, Young Mangoes, of course he had individual figures who incarnated many of these things, but he was always also aware of the larger collective, which placed a certain kind of fragmenting pressure on the individual. And I think that was what was so crucial about his work to me.
Yeah.
And it played out in many ways, because he was, he was present in at least 4 art forms, I'm going to say. And in each one, there were landmark works. And it's, as you say, it's a pity that Gieve was so much a Bombay artist. I don't think he really showed in Calcutta. He had one show in Delhi at Art Heritage, Al-Qazi. But I do wish he'd been better known, because he really was one of those voices that bore witness to post-colonial India. So as a playwright, he wrote 3 plays, Sabaksa, Princess, and Mr. Behram. And in each of them, there was this sense of the wounded, fallible, vulnerable human being. His poems, he was also known as a poet. Again, 3 collections of poetry, but some incredibly memorable poems, one of which some of us studied at school, on killing a tree. And unfortunately, I think our teachers tended more or less to kill the poem by, at the end of it saying, okay, what's going on here? It's reference to context stuff, which I hope doesn't imperil education any longer. But at some point I'd like to read that poem as I feel it should be read.
Yeah.
And of course, as a painter, we're talking about his understanding of what it means to be human.
Right. In fact, that word human brings me to one of the things that when you pick up on when he's talking about these deep distortions or abnormalities or ugliness that can be somewhere repelling or off-putting when you're looking at something that is very visually depicted. At the same time, there is a humanism to his work. There is a kind of an empathy, or there's a sort of a play between being this observer who is able to bring the brutality to the canvas, but at the same time an ability to create a warm connection between the painter and that sense of humanism. You write about it very beautifully, the kind of humanism that he actually embraced, and the idea of the complicit observer, which I found to be very interesting. Would you like to just share that on those concepts?
Definitely.
And maybe
the idea of the complicit observer was something that came to me many years ago when I was actually thinking about the work of Gieve's great friend, Sudhir Patwardhan, fellow painter and artist. It had to do with how a certain generation of artists, Indian artists that came of age in the 1970s, in the early 70s, how did they respond to their responsibility of representing a whole society in transition? The artists, the generation before them had tended to opt for abstraction, or a certain transcendental understanding, or some kind of symbolic vocabulary that connected them to the international art-making languages of, high modernism. But with artists like Gieve Patel, Sudhir Patwardhan, Vivan Sundaram, Ghulam Sheikh, Bhupen Khakkar, there were other urgencies in play. And it's the beginning of recognizing that difference is a very crucial ground of being. So they would reach out for what was immediately at hand, what was regional. In Give's case, looking at the people in the street and not trying to idealize them in any way. In Sudhir's case, it was thinking about the working class. What does it mean to have the physique of a working class person? What does it mean to represent those conditions? But what does it mean to be a person of privilege doing that? Long before these questions, now we take these questions to be very current, but in the early 70s, there was in Sudhir's vocabulary, he often says that, I was guilty of behalfism. What does it mean to speak for someone of another and less privileged class? With Bhupen Khakkar, in his first phase, there was a sense of celebrating in a whimsical manner the idiosyncrasies of a certain kind of middle class milieu. But then as he picked up courage, Bhupen came out, as it were, as effectively India's first openly gay artist, and he was able to bear witness to queer experience. That was a whole new realm of experience that hadn't really been brought into play at all in preceding generations. So this was a crucial generation of artists. They were able to give voice to things hitherto left unspoken, to take up risks and challenges of representation.
Yeah.
So that is where one would situate Gieve. Some of them came together in a landmark exhibition, 1981 Place for People, which was also catalyzed by Geeta Kapoor, who was already a young but already very influential art critic. So you're looking at someone from that generation and with these kinds of concerns.
So one of the points you've been making is that his work was deeply political, though it may not appear to be in a very obvious kind of way, precisely because the kinds of choices he made in terms of the moments that he would focus on, the little interactions, the kind of people he chose to include into his work, as you were saying earlier, point to a deeply inequitable and unfair sort of social organization.
Absolutely.
Right? So looking at some of these images that you've mentioned in your book, would you like to just talk about this one and the one after?
Yeah. I suspect this social moment has vanished now. But there was a time when if you wandered around the lanes near the General Post Office, which is a grand old Indo-Saracenic building in Bombay, it's a George Whitted building, you would find that there were people, migrant workers from, in this case that script apparently is Telugu, but people who came from Andhra Pradesh or Orissa or Bihar or Mithila and made their lives in really intolerable conditions in the big city, but sustained a money order economy which kept their families going in the hinterlands. How would they communicate? And it was typically through this kind of figure, the scribe. And it's a very intriguing relay of communication.
Yeah,
the person dictating has no access to literacy. And so the figure of the scribe here, when we discussed this painting at first, I saw many of Give's paintings for the first time in the studio at in different phases of completion. And he said that's why the scribe is a grander and bigger figure, because he has the power of being lettered. The one dictating is unlettered. So there's a very subtle power play there. And then the message goes out to someone who will then read it out to the recipient. So it's a story about where we are in India with different forms of access to literacy, to education, to power. And even if this particular social moment has gone away with the revolution in mobile telephony, I think it still represents something about the terrible deficits of this society, which we still have to address.
Yeah. And this next painting, the shipbuilding, again you comment on the way in which human relationships, little sort of moments between people, are captured by him. Would you like to just... It strikes me that the figure of the Pandit and the figure of the dog are kind of echoing each other. You know, they're the only curved ones in that sense in the frame. Yeah.
Both Gieve and Sudhir, and one of the essays is about both of them together when they had an exhibition together. In the way in which they responded to what could broadly be called the subaltern classes, Gieve tended to focus on the marginal and vulnerable, Sudhir more on workers of certain kinds. But in Gieve's oeuvre, this is kind of a different thing because it's very particularly the Kohli community in Bombay. It's the traditional fishing community, which is one of the earliest social strata in Bombay. It's still a very powerful presence, culturally and otherwise. But what intrigues me here is how theatre-like this painting is. There's a certain sense of approaching the tableau which you have in a number of Gieve's paintings. And I think that actually comes out of his preoccupation with the theatre. And it's really interesting that in a couple of days you're going to have Amal here with her the book on her father.
Right? Yeah, Al-Ghazi.
That's where Gieve started as a student. He was part of Al-Ghazi's circle, theatre unit. I make some reference to that. Gieve's beginnings in theatre were under the aegis of this extremely amazing magisterial figure, Ibrahim Al-Ghazi, who was still in Bombay at the time. He later went to Delhi and directed the National School of Drama and so on. But I think the impress of theatre in the way it was, you know all about this, Anjum. It has to do with blocking and marking and how you symbolize certain relationships. Al-Ghazi always talked about how for him theatre was about a succession of visual moments, which would be so powerful that they imprint themselves on the mind of the audience. So I see some of that in some of these paintings.
Right. The thing that struck me is that you almost get a sense of a very closely observed and well-developed, rounded character. Like that boy is standing on the right, the way he's standing, there's a sense of completeness to him as a person. You can almost sort of imagine the thoughts in his head as he listens on or partly listens on to the two women talking. So there is even though, this isn't, these paintings, I'll show you another one. This is a grieving family by the roadside. These paintings don't maybe look like very, very detailed work, but at the same time they're capturing full human experiences and moments where you can really enter into the story or the narrative of that particular moment. So I think what you talk about when you said about the theatrical tableau, this one, for example, is very, very much echoing, beautifully arranged, but sort of a moment which could actually be on a stage, right? These are 3 pictures of mourners. Again, there's no attempt at realistic detail as such, and yet the moment of mourning and the moment of despair comes through very clearly. So, to my mind, these are all part of what Ranjit talks about in several of his essays about this deep humanism, that the fact of the looking at the deeply bestial, ugly, so-called anesthetic, but at the same time with that deep sense of humanism running through, and looking at the ordinary human being, the marginalized human being. So this is one big aspect of the work that you talk about. And I would like to now move on to another aspect which Ranjit then begins to talk about in the essays, which is the sense of a transcendence, where you're moving from this very sad, maybe a world which is very rooted in day-to-day detail, and you're moving into a space which is between that and a certain kind of transcendent or spiritual space. So, would you like to just talk about that aspect?
Thank you for reflecting on this painting particularly, Anjum, because we're moving also here during the late 90s to Give's engagement with material that appeared first as photographs. I mean, there's a moment early in his oeuvre where he is doing that. He's responding to newspaper photographs of dead politicians or political events. And then, as paintings, he figures out how you can play that for satire, for instance. Here, something else happens. This is actually a photograph that appeared on the front page of the Times of India. It's a photograph by Hoshi Jal, who was the photo editor at the Times of Bombay. And it actually happened. This is a real event. For some strange reason, a peacock from Malabar Hill seems to have escaped and gone across the water to Nariman Point and was found in an office. And that's the banal everyday, I mean, it's not so banal, it's a strange thing to happen. But it piqued Give's imagination. And when you look at it here, you're suddenly struck by, what's going on actually? Is it someone who has trapped a bird, or is the bird some kind of soul that's leaping out of this man's body? So it also marks the point at which Gieve began to move from that earlier, if you will, sovereign humanist position to a larger sense of how we as a species are completely linked to other species. I mean, this is so much part of the debate today. We're all recognizing, as we approach the brink of our own extinction as a species, we've belatedly figured that, the world is actually a fabric of interrelationships among species. But it's that kind of realization that came to Gieve at this point. It also involved recovering memories of his very strong connections with rural Gujarat. So maybe if you just move to the next one. This is called the water tank at Nargol, and if any of you have ever had anything to do with the India Foundation of the Arts, you will know that its logo comes from this painting. It's this incredible, I'm tempted to say swan, it's more likely a kind of goose. This will involve us in Sanskrit quibbling, because the hamsa is a kind of goose rather than a swan, but anyway, that's another debate. What is of interest and importance here is the way he really, through his brushwork, indicates how the bark of the tree, human skin, the buffalo, the bird, all of these are very, very closely connected. Although the tree is bearing down into the anchorage of gravity, the bird is lifting up, the buffalo is wallowing in the water, all kinds of things are going on in that painting. But there's a way in which, through very precise technical formal means, he finds a way of presenting it as a singular fabric.
This painting, the strange, mythical crow with the eggshell, also to me spoke of the same kind of movement from, sort of lifting it into a transcendental space. Would you have something to say about this painting?
He was fascinated by the Bombay crow, a species that's endangered by pigeons. I think there's a kind of a pigeon epidemic in Bombay for some reason. This is what happens when you start interfering with the lives of other species. But for all kinds of reasons, the crow is under attack. But Gieve responded very, very strongly to this figure. It's, what is it to look at a bird that's technically a scavenger, but that yet has great dignity? I think these aspects of the bird fascinated him.
Right.
And there's a long and rather lively poem of his called Bombay Central, which has to do with one of our big train stations. And there again, his eye falls on precisely this kind
on the crow.
On the crow. Or this, which is actually, I think, in some ways based on the view from his own balcony on Nepean Sea Road. But it's this way of thinking about the dignity of a member of a species that may not be able to communicate linguistically, but conveys meaning in other ways.
Right. So, we, for me at least, and I'm hoping for you as well, there's already a movement in the kind of images that were there earlier to a few of these images, which are a sort of have a different tonality and a different kind of affect. And the image that I'm going to show you next, I chose that as a kind of a midway, somewhere, a kind of a pause. Before we move into a different kind of phase of his work. I found this extremely powerful and affecting. And it is called Embrace, which again leaves us groping for our own narrative, because who is embracing whom? What is the embrace for? What is it about? Ranjit, you have an interpretation of it, or a series of interpretations of it, and you link it to a particular sort of looking at a certain kind of a spiritual or reaching for
on one level.
So would you?
I think what tends to happen with some images is that they provoke us in what might look like opposite directions, but then you realize that it's the reading of, we all know this, otherwise you wouldn't be here. You know that when you read images or you respond to them or you create them, you're not setting up interpretation as a binary event. It's not either this or that. There's a whole spectrum of meaning that an image gives you. Again, the origin of this painting lies in a newspaper photograph from the sports page this time, from some incident in some part of a soccer match. But as that image took possession of Gieve's mind, it began to open itself up in different directions. So there's a very, very strong current in Gieve's work that is based on his deep devotion to the great European tradition of painting, the Renaissance, Mannerism, the Baroque. And I can't help feeling that through that lens, you can see this as something that comes out of a Christology, the life of a saint, some episode in the life of a martyr. So there's all that realm of possibility. Another key current in Gieve's work, and when you look at all of his work, you see the plays and the poetry and so on, you find that there was also an awareness that sexual experience, gender identity, these are not fixities. They are, in fact, more fluid than we imagine. And I think that was a concern that came up. For instance, Mr. Behram, his play, at the center of it are these two figures. The Parsi lawyer who adopts the Barli boy, boy of tribal heritage, and educates him. And there's an incredible tension there, which is at one level paternal, at another level sexual. So I think this was definitely a concern that you can trace across Gieve's work. And in this case, again, if you want to see it through that lens, then this also has to do with homoerotic tenderness. And I'm aware that, you might wonder, what are you talking about? Is this a Giotto saint or is this something else? But I think it speaks to the capaciousness of certain images, that they open themselves up to different forms of interpretation and they have equally valid meaning.
Right. And therefore allow you your own, personal interpretation, which is as valid as anybody else's. Yeah, great. So we've already started talking a little bit about a sort of a strain of a particular kind of spiritualism, which you recognize very strongly in Gieve, and you talk about in the book in several of the essays. So I was going to move on next to a whole series of paintings that Gieve has done, which are actually threaded through the book, right from the beginning to the end, which are his paintings of wells. And Ranjit has spoken very beautifully about the symbolism of the well. The play between surface and depth, the entry into another world. I don't want to use those, to take the words out of his mouth, so maybe he could talk a little bit about
the wells.
The well. Yeah.
Although Gieve didn't sit down and paint in series, it tended to happen that he would return to a certain theme or a certain form. So many of the paintings we saw earlier had to do with a series that informally he thought of as his Gallery of Man series, which is already an ironic riff on the Family of Man exhibition that had toured the world in the 1960s. Very, very influential exhibition, but had to do with optimistic and heroic possibilities of humankind. The exhibition was supported by the State Department, but we won't go into that part of things. But the wells, that series spoke to a completely different concern that Gieve had. At its core was this childhood experience from Nargol and Sanjan, rural Gujarat, of looking into a well as a child, gauging depth, wondering what went on in the mysterious depths, wondering where this went. And I think retrieving that experience as an adult, it also seemed to him that the well could be a pathway between two universes. And it's interesting that the point of view always is of someone looking in, but there's never a reflection. So in a sense, there's a dissolution of the viewing and the representing ego. And what you have instead is the primacy of this. Is it a void? Is it a plenum? Is it both? And there's also a great suffusion of different kinds of life and vitality around the well. Sometimes there's a dry branch, sometimes there's a spray of bougainvillea, there's all kinds of things going on. There's also typology. Some of these are traditional deep wells, some are bore wells, some are shafts, some have winches. It's not an archetype. It's an archetype that's then spelled out in these very particular ways.
Yeah. So this sense of the well being this and that, being a surface and a depth, being almost like a navel into a deep, center of the earth. All the kind of symbolism or the thoughts or the connections that one then starts stirring when you start thinking of a well in that way. In that sense, I felt that it links up a lot with the aspect of Gieve's painting, and his other work as well, which you, in a sense, start your book with a very interesting observation on the particular strain of seeking or spiritualism that you identify with as well, and that you felt that Gieve had very strongly in his work, where you talk about the Krishnamurti, but you also have a very interesting quote about the presence of a certain kind of aggressive secularism in the cultural field. And so I'll just read this to you because I think it's a very important thing to think about right now. In a field as vehemently secularized as the contemporary arts, Gieve and I shared an abiding preoccupation with the life of spiritual quest, not as an academic interest or a research topic, but as an existential reality. It was important to secure a zone of reflection and inquiry into these subjects, away from the twin pressures of aggressive secularization on the one hand and politicized religiosity on the other, each as dogmatic, reductive, intolerant, and ultimately unproductive as the other. I felt this was a very interesting point and a very interesting space and position, because it is something that forms part of a lot of thinking and conversation, where one understands that there isn't a clear black and white between those who are outright rejecting everything to do with religion and spirituality and its expression, and those who are using it as a weapon or a bludgeoning tool or as a divisive tool. And that there should be an ability to be able to question, pursue, seek a third kind of space. So would you like to share that with us?
I think these questions have been with us across generations, because on the one hand there's the sense that so much about religious life has been dominated by a ritual, by unquestionable dogma and so on, and it constrains human possibilities. So there's been a corresponding move towards the rational, the skeptical, and so on. But at some point, certainly in Gieve's generation, I think people hit the limit of that. Because there's a point beyond which that sort of rationality can become corrosive of its own objects. And an insistence on a certain kind of empirical verifiability then kind of collapses on itself, because you're refusing to acknowledge certain levels or realms of experience because you feel, my instruments don't tell me anything about this. It's possible that you need other kinds of instruments, for one. So that's one whole set of problems. On the other side is this increasingly ascendant tendency to use religion as a weapon, to weaponize religion into a religiosity, to use it as a political counter, to effectively invent hard-edged identities which promise you some kind of religious belonging, but actually are just kitsch, quite frankly. And that's the current that's in the ascendant right now. So I think many of these questions, whether it was for Gieve's generation or mine or the generations between, all that really became very, very dramatically real in 1992. Honestly, 6th December 1992 was a moment of great rupture, where it was very clear that the kinds of Nehruvian values that we had been brought up with, the republic we took for granted, was really in danger. And that there was a new kind of claim on public sphere and social organization that we had to contend with. So in the middle of all of this, how do you deal with questions of developing a, if you will, a certain kind of private spiritual practice? For Gieve, that journey had begun a little earlier, because he realized that a purely scientific attitude wasn't giving him certain answers, where he belonged in a larger scheme of things. So he found himself attracted to this ashram in Mirtola, Swami Krishna Prem, who actually was British and had at some point become Vaishnav, but whose spiritual practice was premised on, there was a deep discipline, but there was also a sense of the joy and wonderment of the universe. It wasn't about austerity and self-mortification. And I think from conversations that I go back now in my mind, for Gieve, this was crucial, that spirituality was not about punishing yourself. It was actually seeking avenues of wonderment and a larger belonging, which is what I think eventually attracted him to Krishnamurti's teachings. Yeah, and I remember him saying to me, Krishnamurti is one of the few philosophers who actually has a place for beauty. Not as an extra, but as a way of achieving some kind of illumination. I think that meant a lot to him.
Before we move on to inviting the audience to participate, so keep your questions ready. There is one very important point again that Ranjit, you make in your essays about Gieve insisting on a painterly route to solving certain problems of representation.
Right.
And you talk about the fact that he uses the craft of painting and the preoccupations of painting to do that. And given that we've got so many artists in the audience here, maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit?
If you look back at this great essay that he wrote for Daedalus, the journal, I think that appeared at some point in the early 90s, he was already preparing a series of arguments for the continuing relevance of painting proper. And that became more and more of a theme with him as we passed into a moment where it was felt that painting was now exhausted and that you necessarily needed to move to video or installation or performance. There was a time in our art world when you look back now, you think, my goodness, we were just squabbling over media when the more important questions were not the media in themselves, but what purpose they served. But this is how it was. And for Gieve, he was very, very clear that painting was inexhaustible and that it had survived and would continue to do so. And he had no academic training as a painter, so he was really very systematic autodidact. And to him, there was something sacrosanct about the moment of painting. And he would go, for instance, this is actually a good way of thinking about it. I mean, these might seem like trivial things, but he would say, it's a very important question. How does one paint water? Or how does one paint grass? And then he would go back over. There was a period when he was painting the images of the mourners that we saw. That comes out of a long preoccupation with representing grief. So he was deeply fascinated by how painters through the centuries had represented tears, for instance. So you would go back to Roger van der Weyden, zoom up closer to the present and look at Picasso. He was fascinated by this question of how through physical and immediate formal means, how do you represent deep emotional states that are otherwise invisible? I think that interplay of what can be sensed and what can be shown, that was crucial for him.
And in a sense, with the sort of the continuous exploration of these surfaces in different ways, you can see there was a very beautiful one where he has the sky, right? This one, How do you paint that? Okay. Is there anything you would like to talk about or add that you feel we haven't focused on in this?
Kind of a stray thought in one sense, because I tend to think in terms of intergenerational connections. As we were speaking, I just thought that for someone who technically came from another discipline, who was an autodidact, he also had the great fortune to have mentors in each one of these disciplines. In theatre, he was Alkazi's student. In poetry, he had Nissim Ezekiel as a guru. In the visual arts, he had Akbar Padamsi as his, if you look at their work, it's not like they were painting in any way in the same style, but there was a profound common ground that they had in terms of what they read, what they thought to be important, what the quest was. And also he was a translator. He spent decades working on a Gujarati Vaishnav saint poet called Akho. And in that domain, again, a close friend of his who was his mentor was A.K. Ramanujan, the poet, translator, and cultural anthropologist. So I'm just struck by how, if you want to situate Gieve, you'll find that he has a place in many of these different histories. And it's through these, if you will, relationships of mentoring that he found himself sustained in these different arts.
And you have a presence in most of them as well. So do you feel that in any one of them he was a mentor or a guide?
To me?
Yeah.
He very much as a poet, I think, although again, his poetry and mine have very little to do with each other, but there was a very strong sense that, I've said this before, I said it to Chandrahas and Bhubaneswar a few days ago, but I'm going to say it again. I think it was in my early 20s, and I felt I was hitting up against some kind of wall, so asked Gieve what I should be thinking about or doing as a poet. So he said, you have to go down deep to where things are broken to write poetry. And at which point I said, why on earth would I do that? I want to surge forth and look at new things and experiment with new forms. It's all this nonsense about things being broken. The trouble with wisdom is that you've got to, you learn it the hard way. You have a guru-like figure telling you, you obviously spurn that advice. But over the years, I realized that, once you've been buffeted around for a certain number of decades, you'll say, right, he was right. And then when you pay attention, in fact, to what is broken or deep sources of grief, things that need healing, or where you feel at a tangent to the world, that in fact is where, those are the nodes from which, you then find form. So instead of just looking for experimental forms actually emerge from these deep experiences. So that was this sort of Mahavakya that he gave me. But in many other ways, large and small, he was so present. And again, I see him as part of this now vanished moment, I think, in Bombay particularly, but also other cities. But in Bombay, there was this moment in the late 70s through the 80s, up to the 90s, where the arts were not rigidly, professionally divided into silos. So, for instance, the way I grew up was among artists, poets, architects, theatre makers. There was the sense that these were different things. There was a deep sense of, in fact, looking for patterns across domains.
Yeah, thank you for that.